Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the absolute greatest magic tricks in human history. We are going to uncover the ancient philosophical secrets that early leaders actually used to justify extreme social hierarchies. For thousands of years, you had this tiny elite at the very top of the social pyramid enjoying just immense wealth, while literally millions of people at the bottom broke their backs doing manual labor. But here's the thing, they didn't just rule by the sword, they ruled by the mind. They built these invisible pillars of philosophy that convinced the masses this totally unequal setup wasn't just normal, but that it was actually meant to be.
Now, to really get this, we gotta rewind to a massive shift that hit around 4000 BCE in the Mesopotamian city of Uruk. Before this, humans were mostly hunter-gatherers, right? But Uruk figured out a way to mass harvest cereal grains, like wheat and barley, using this really strenuous new invention called a hand mill. This whole complex agricultural process allowed Uruk to boom into a city of over 50,000 people. But here is the crazy part. Imagine literally shrinking half a foot just to survive, because that is exactly what happened. The average height of men drastically shrunk from 5'9" to 5'3". Women went from 5'3" to just 5 feet. Instead of being these super athletes, we became smaller, overworked farmers, toiling away day in and day out, just to give our surplus crops to kings who grew incredibly wealthy. So why on earth did the masses accept this raw deal?
Well, looking at the historical record, it boils down to two main reasons. The first one is just pure necessity. Simply put, it took millions of people working the land just to feed an empire and keep their families alive. But, necessity alone isn't going to stop a massive revolt. The second, and honestly far more powerful reason, is philosophy. Rulers maintained order by crafting these intricate belief systems that made the working class actively accept their place. Over millennia, leaders perfected three primary philosophical pillars to justify their absolute power.
Okay, let's dive into this. The very first major thematic pillar of power is what we'll call the divine endorsement.
This was the most direct, straightforward justification a ruler could possibly use, claiming an infallible, direct hotline to the heavens. A flawless example of this is ancient Egypt. Think about their entire social pyramid. From the slaves and peasants at the absolute bottom, up through the artisans, the merchants, scribes, soldiers, and bureaucrats. The whole thing was designed with one single purpose, to serve the pharaoh. And the pharaoh wasn't just a politician. He was viewed as a divine immortal, literally the supreme mediator between the gods and the world of men. The entire empire genuinely believed that when a pharaoh died, his successful journey into the afterlife guaranteed the ongoing stability of their world. And that's exactly why poor peasants would spend their off seasons from farming doing the backbreaking work of building massive pyramids. It was to ensure their divine leader was worshipped forever, ruling in perpetuity. If the gods put the king in charge, who are you, a mere mortal farmer, to question it?
Meanwhile, over in China, the Zhou dynasty formalized this divine right into a super strict political doctrine known as the Mandate of Heaven. They laid it out with 4 ironclad rules. First, heaven explicitly grants the right to rule. Second, since there is only one heaven, there can only be one emperor. But crucially, and this is the clever part, that right isn't permanent. It relies entirely on the emperor's virtue. This was just a brilliant philosophical tool. It gave the ruler absolute, unquestioned authority, but it also seamlessly explained away the fall of an empire. If a natural disaster hit, like a major drought, massive floods, or earthquakes, it was seen as a clear signal that the heavens were actively revoking their blessing. It made the whole system look totally flawless in the eyes of the everyday people.
That brings us to our second pillar of justification, the right of merit and wisdom. Basically, if you couldn't claim a direct line to the gods, rulers argue that absolute power rightfully belongs to those who practically and intellectually deserve it.
The legend of Yu the Great in China just brilliantly illustrates the birth of this meritocracy. Picture this, around 2100 BCE, you've got these massive, completely devastating floods from the Yellow River destroying crops and causing widespread famine. Imagine facing a relentless natural disaster for over a decade. Well, Yu spent 13 grueling years traveling the river, executing this monumental logistical feat of building levees and dikes to regulate the waterways. When he finally solved this massive problem and stopped the floods, the overjoyed people hailed him as a literal savior. This created the Shah dynasty and set a hugely important precedent. The idea that an individual who earns absolute power by solving society's biggest problems, well, they deserve to have absolute power.
Fast forward a bit, and you see this exact same idea of intellectual merit being fiercely defended in ancient Greece by the famous philosopher Plato. In Book 6 of his work, The Republic, Plato compares running a state to captaining a ship. He wrote that the true navigator must study the seasons of the year, the sky, the stars, the winds, if he is really fit to control the ship. Plato basically viewed the art of state navigation as a highly specialized elite skill Definitely not something just anyone off the street could do.
So Plato actually used this ship captain analogy to heavily criticize Athenian democracy. See, in Athens, the Council of 500 was chosen by random sortition. They used this crazy machine called a cleritarion that literally spit out random tokens to assign everyday citizens to the government. Plato thought letting a machine spit out random tokens to choose leaders was completely chaotic and barbaric. Instead, he argued for this elitist philosophical ideal called the Philosopher King, a man who dedicates his entire life to the study of wisdom, logic, and reasoning. Plato argued that only these highly trained intellectual elites should ever be allowed to hold the reins of power.
But, there's a pretty glaring issue when we stack Plato's beautiful, idealized vision up against gritty historical reality. Throughout history, basically every single leader arrogantly assumed that their own ideas were the wisest. From Yu the Great in China, to Labarnus uniting the Hittite Empire, to a young Siddhartha Gautama living in his perfect palace utopia before becoming the Buddha, every ruler inherently believed they were the true philosopher king. And this deeply held belief justified them taking power, even if, in reality, they were just tyrants in disguise.
And that leads us right into Pillar 3, human nature and the law. When divinity and merit just weren't enough, rulers justified their dominance by philosophically concluding that human nature is inherently flawed, selfish, and requires harsh, unyielding control.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how incredibly early this cynical view was codified into law. Take King Hammurabi's code from ancient Babylon, right around 1772 BCE. Hammurabi etched 282 strict laws onto a massive 7-foot stone slab. Look at this rule. If a noble destroys the eye or breaks the bone of another noble, the punishment is equal, an eye for an eye. But if a noble destroys the eye of a man's slave, he merely pays a fine of 1/2 his price. Hammurabi used the brutal mathematics of hierarchy to completely destroy any illusion of human equality. By legally placing people into these rigid castes of value, he justified treating the masses as lesser beings who absolutely needed to be managed and controlled by the elites.
This hyper-cynical take on human nature actually became official state policy over in China under the Qin dynasty, which was heavily influenced by Han Feizi's philosophy of legalism. Legalism explicitly taught that humans are just inherently selfish, always acting in their own self-interest, and therefore a powerful ruler has to enforce order through a really strict system of harsh punishments and rewards. However, when the Qin dynasty eventually fell, the subsequent Han dynasty under Liu Bang realized that ruling purely by force was unstable. You can only crack the whip for so long, right? So they pivoted their empire toward Confucianist ideals, realizing that teaching moderation, virtue, and piety was a much more sustainable way to actually build a powerful, lasting empire.
And it's fascinating because these ancient legal and philosophical frameworks actually map perfectly onto a famous deduction made way later, during the Renaissance, by Niccolo Machiavelli in his political manifesto, The Prince. Machiavelli famously wrote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved." He argued that love is broken at every opportunity for personal advantage. But fear? Fear is preserved by a constant dread of punishment. Think back to those overworked ancient farmers we started with. Why on earth did they submit to giving their hard-earned wheat to these wealthy lords? Well, Machiavelli's logic tells us they did it largely out of dread. They were terrified of what invading barbarians, like the Huns or the Mongols, would do to their families if they didn't have the state's military elite right there to protect them.
But here's the thing. Humans can only live in a state of pure fear for so long. To keep the gears of civilization turning without constant daily rebellion, rulers needed a solution. So they relied heavily on pacifying philosophies, specific belief systems designed to help the working class mentally endure their rigid, backbreaking place in the social order.
Over in the East, Confucius taught a system heavily focused on respect, loyalty, and responsibility in all relationships. Central to this whole idea is the concept of Li. You can think of it as the ultimate set of formal and informal societal manners and obligations that guide everyday behavior. By teaching that following these strict social conventions maintained cosmic harmony and order, Confucianism gave the peasants a real sense of noble purpose. It made their servitude feel like a vital duty to the universe, which made a really tough life a lot more bearable.
Right around that same era, Lao Tzu introduces Taoism. Now, unlike those harsh, rigid laws we saw in Babylon, Taoism taught that individuals should seek to align themselves peacefully with the natural flow of the universe, rather than fighting against it. A famous concept here is yin and yang, the balance of opposing, complementary forces. Taoism essentially taught the lower classes not to stress about external political forces that were totally outside of their control. Instead, it encouraged them to find inner peace and serene fulfillment right where they already were.
So, the crucial point is this. While rulers were at the top using legalism and divine mandates to enforce taxes and labor from the top down, these pacifying Eastern philosophies were working from the bottom up. They ultimately convinced those overworked ancient farmers to accept their lot in life. By seeking inner harmony and just fulfilling their familial duties, the masses were philosophically programmed to endure their labor without ever rebelling against the king. They were told essentially, just focus on your farming.
As we look back at this grand sweep of human civilization, from the shrinking farmers of Uruk to the massive pyramids, from the mandate of heaven all the way to Machiavelli's prince, we see clearly that the architecture of power is built on ideas just as much as it is on stone and steel. Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. As you look at the political structures governing our world right now, today, do you think modern leaders still rely on these ancient pillars of divine right, intellectual merit, and fear to justify their rule? It's definitely something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.